So now I invite Janice Peters to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which you'll find in your order of service.
I light the chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which is printed in your order of service, saying,
Love is the doctrine of the church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. In the latest issue of UU World magazine, devoted to the theme of shared ministry, senior editor Elaine McCardle wrote, "The concept of shared ministry is ascendant within Unitarian Universalism today. It means sharing leadership by transcending hierarchies and rethinking traditional divisions among the roles of ministers, religious educators, music ministers, lay leaders, and others. Shared ministry is an approach, collaborative, interconnected, less strictly hierarchical, that lives into the faith's highest values. Shared ministry is a concept that is decades in the making, fostered by the work of many." I became a Unitarian Universalist in one of our many incubators of shared ministry and shared leadership. At that time, nearly 40 years ago, philosophies of shared leadership and shared ministry had already been decades in the making. The congregation I joined, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Huntington, New York, was established in 1947 as one of the first lay-led groups recognized under the American Unitarian Association's new fellowship designation, and had a long history of living its philosophy of shared leadership and shared ministry. And Gordon McKeeman's writings soon became touchstones for us and many others who were experimenting with shared ministry and shared leadership in one way or another. It has always been the case, at least since the Reformation, that churches really are run by their members. Lay leadership has always been crucial to their success. The goal of the Reformation was to liberate the people from an elite and oppressive hierarchy. Different ways of organizing, Episcopal, Presbyterian, congregational, were tried. Different degrees of freedom in divining spiritual truth were allowed. Most experiments gravitated back toward some sort of hierarchy, even in the freest churches. And that pattern has persisted. What has changed over the last century or so is that in some traditions, like ours, we have become more willing to admit, accept, and openly practice a more democratic faith. I was surprised to learn how our churches struck a delicate balance of free faith and hierarchical custom once upon a time. Exploring the archives of the Universalist Unitarian Church of Riverside, California, founded in 1881, I learned that the church's original name was the First Universalist Church or Parish of Riverside. That was the name the men could agree upon for its administrative organization. Its purpose, that administrative organization, its purpose was to provide financial and institutional support for the work of their first minister, who was there from the beginning, the Reverend George Deere, the nephew of John Deere of tractor fame. Later on, Reverend Deere gathered the women of the church and founded a parallel organization All Souls Universalist Church to support and carry out ministries of care, worship, and children's religious education. The explicit reflection of social and gender roles in that organizational structure is telling. It is also a window into the underlying fact of shared ministry in its operation. Fast forward to 1933 and that valley of shadows we call the Great Depression, a time of crisis for many churches. To survive, the Riverside Church would combine with a Unitarian congregation in nearby Redlands, California, 22 years before the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association consolidated to become the UUA. Also, during those Depression years came an overt and honest expression of religious humanism called a Humanist Manifesto, which declared that religion consists of those actions, purposes, and experiences which are humanly significant. Nothing human is alien to the religious. It was the ultimate Protestant statement, encouraging individuals to seek spiritual truth for themselves. Now, Gordon McKeeman was ordained to the ministry in the Universalist Church in 1945. Nicknamed Bucky, he was a charter member of a small group of Universalist ministers who named themselves the Humiliati, the humble ones. They stressed that human beings are impelled, not compelled, by the power of God to fulfill the good potential of their lives. The impulse toward wholeness in humanity is predisposed to good, though it can be weakened or distorted by chaos and conflict. Authentic worship keeps it alive and restores its integrity. That was their statement. And one can hear in that statement its resonance with the earlier humanist one. The group disbanded in 1954, electing Bucky their lifetime abbot. In his last years, he wistfully reflected upon being its last living member. The 1970s and 1980s witnessed a loud, generation-long lament about the decline of mainline churches. Some of you may remember hearing that year after year after year. Congregations and whole denominations steadily shrank, inspiring the Episcopalian Reverend Lauren Mead to found the Alban Institute in 1974. For 40 years, that organization, as its website says, pioneered new ways of enabling congregational leaders to be agents of grace and transformation that could shape and heal the world. He's talking about lay people. Through its publishing house, educational offerings, and consulting practice, it tackled vexing issues such as conflict, transition, and mission in congregational and ministerial life, creating a rich, valuable resource for congregations, pastors, and individuals alike. In 2014, Alban transferred all of its intellectual properties to Duke University and created an endowment to support future programs that continue the Alban mission. Much literature about shared leadership and shared ministry emerged during Alban's run. At first, mostly about best practices for lay participation in the caring ministry of their church, and then increasingly about lay participation and leadership in all the church's ministries, and about discovering their gifts and discovering lay ministry in whatever area as a path to spiritual growth. In 1989, Reverend John Buren stated, "Properly understood, ministry is something we all can do in many different ways, whether lay or ordained, in church or beyond its walls." That was kind of in the air at that time. When Behrens became president of the UUA in 1993, the UUA's Women and Religion Committee undertook a study of shared ministry, published in 1996 as the Shared Ministry Sourcebook. Its editor, my colleague Barbara Child, described the study. The committee wrote to the president of every North American Unitarian Universalist congregation and asked them to define ministry, shared ministry, and other related terms. Respondents were invited to describe the shared ministry programs in their congregations, to express the philosophy in their behind those programs, and to comment on benefits and drawbacks. The committee received more than 60 responses, as one might expect. Some of the stories were about success, some were about struggle, all were about change. Well, I was one of those congregational presidents who got the survey. I made copies of their questionnaire, distributed it to all of our current and other experienced leaders, and contributed our collective response to the study. Ours was one of the 18 responses shared in the source book. The source book was one of several titles on shared ministry published during John Behrens' presidency. Some of you might remember the essay collections Salted with Fire and All Are Chosen. Also during this time, the UUA Commission on Appraisal published their interdependence report, which sparked our recovery of covenanting as a spiritual practice. And twice in those years, Bucky McKeeman's Ministry is All That We Do was published, first in a meditation collection titled Awakened from the Forest, edited by my colleague Gary Smith, and then in McKeeman's own collection, Out of the Ordinary. All of this was happening as I prepared to enter seminary, studied at seminary, completed my internship, and made my way to my first settlement in Riverside. It reinforced my decade or so of experience as a lay leader in Huntington and further shaped my personal response to the call to ministry. Belonging to a community that leaned into leadership and ministry as a path to spiritual growth for church members was an empowering and liberating experience for me as a young adult. My enthusiasm for and adherence to that philosophy that all ministry is shared comes from my own experience of how all that we do together here and out in the wider community can contribute to each person's spiritual development towards their best and whole self. There is no moment in the life of a church that in that sense cannot become a holy moment, a life-giving, even life-saving moment. Giving the spirit of mutual love a fine chance to work among us as we seek to become a beloved community where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. And as we work with our neighbors to make a better and more just society. And even when we're doing maintenance or administrative tasks together, or just putting up chairs, when we do it all in the spirit of mutual love, mutual learning, and mutual support, it takes on an empowering and liberating quality with implications far beyond the moment, far beyond the task, because it is transformed from mere work into a spiritual practice. In her introduction to the Shared Ministry Sourcebook, Barbara Child wrote, "At the root of shared ministry is the belief that all people, not just clergy, are called to share their gifts and to serve one another in religious community. Sharing the ministry means lay people participating in worship services, visiting the sick and elderly, leading religious education programs, and making other contributions to the congregation's ministry. For clergy, sharing the ministry means engaging the entire congregation in the spiritual well-being of its community. And she also quoted another meditation by McKeeman, with which I close. Ministry is a quality of relationship between and among human beings that beckons forth hidden possibilities, inviting people into deeper, more constant, more reverent relationship with the world and with one another, carrying forward a long heritage of hope and liberation that has dignified and informed the human venture over many centuries, being present with, to, and for others in their terrors and torments, their grief, misery, and pain, knowing that those feelings are our feelings too, celebrating the triumphs of the human spirit, the miracles of birth and life, the wonders of devotion and sacrifice, witnessing to the life-enhancing values, speaking truth to power, standing for human dignity and equity, for compassion and aspiration, believing in life and in the presence of death, struggling for human responsibility against principalities and structures that ignore humaneness and become instruments of death. It is all these and much, much more than all of them present in the wordless, the unspoken, the ineffable. It is speaking and living the highest we know and living with the knowledge that it is never as deep or as wide or as high as we wish. Whenever there is a meeting that summons us to our better selves, wherever our lostness is found, our fragments are united, or our wounds begin healing. Our spines stiffen and our muscles grow strong for the task. There is ministry. May we continue to lean into such ministry here. Amen.
I now invite Janice to come forward to extinguish our chalice. And please join me in saying our closing words, which if you don't know them, they are printed in the order of service. Go out
into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings. And may you go forth surrounded by the spirit of mutual love.